So good morning, Rīga. Good morning to everyone gathered online. Also probably good afternoon and good evening wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this very first side session of the Riga conference program. And indeed we have an incredible pleasure and honor to kickstart the entire conference today. My name is Tomas Jermalavičius. I am Head of Studies at the International Center for Defense and Security, a think tank in Tallinn. And today we will discuss, certainly not a sideshow, we will discuss a very core matters of the contemporary geopolitics. The session entitled Geopolitical and Geoeconomic Implications of the Indo-Pacific Region Stability or Confrontation. And indeed, the Indo-Pacific has become a focal point of security discussions lately in Europe and in North America, and for multiple reasons. Rise of China and its influence, combined with its assertiveness and sometimes confrontational stance, economic importance of this region to the world in terms of technology, trade, supply chains, as well as due to the region containing a number of sources of instability and conflict, interstate rivalries, territorial claims, failed or failing states beset by insurgencies, regional arms races, and when you come to think of it, actually all 5 official and 3 unofficial nuclear states are all geographically present there. And also, of course, the last but not least, environmental importance of Indo-Pacific. When we talk about climate change, biodiversity, reduction of pollution, you cannot really have this discussion without Indo-Pacific representatives being at the table. Of course, China now takes up a lot of oxygen in the discussions, for instance, in Washington. And Indo-Pacific is now central to the US strategy. The pivot to the Indo-Pacific is really genuine and going on in earnest. Some European powers like France, UK, Germany also expressed strong desire to enhance their presence in the Indo-Pacific. NATO, not alien to the region either, to this part of the globe. It has been cultivating a number of so-called global partners in it for a number of years now. And even the EU is paying a lot of attention too. It has just recently published a strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific in April 2021. And the discussion also is taking up quite a lot of energy and interest. The Economist recently lamented the lack of excitement about the unresolved issues so close to home, to Europe, while so much attention is lavished to the Indo-Pacific. And I quote, "In the Pacific, the European leaders see history being made. In the Balkans, they see history being repeated to the point of tedium." And I think in the Nordic-Baltic region, we also increasingly discuss China and in the Indo-Pacific, but perhaps we hear not enough from those who represent this vast area of the globe. So the side event is to address a key question. Are the geopolitical and geoeconomic trends in and related to the Indo-Pacific pushing us towards ever greater confrontation, or to the contrary, enhance the chances of stability as various groupings of nations come together to counterbalance the rising and increasingly assertive China? And we have an excellent panel today to discuss this question, consisting of speakers from 3 out of 4 nations that form the so-called Quad, the quadrilateral strategic dialogue format in the region. And it's my great pleasure to introduce the panel of today. First, Tsuneo Watanabe, Senior Research Fellow from Sasakawa Peace Foundation in Tokyo. Good evening to you, Watanabe-san. Ambassador Anil, Wadhwa, Distinguished Fellow at Vivekananda International Foundation in New Delhi. Good afternoon, probably not yet evening to you. And Natasha Kassam, Director of Public Opinion and Foreign Policy Program at Lowy Institute in Australia, in Sydney, I think, based. So good evening to you as well, Natasha Kassam. And if anyone wishes to step up with the US flag to complete this squad here today, welcome to do so. And in the way that it is organized, the online viewers can watch it live stream on various platforms, Facebook, also conference website, and post questions through Slido. We will keep an eye on the space, and we will bring those questions in and put forward to the panel. And also, please do comment on Twitter, Facebook using a hashtag RigaConf2021. So each of the panelists now will spend about 10 to 12 minutes to share their thoughts and perspectives as a kickoff for the discussion. This session, as you may understand, is not under the Chatham House rule, so everything can be quoted and used against us. So, Watanabe-san, I would like to turn to you first. A few years back, I think in 2016, you contributed a chapter to the NATO Defense College report on NATO and the Indo-Pacific. And you argued that at that time, while the Obama administration very repeatedly reaffirmed America's military commitment to the Asia-Pacific as part of its rebalancing policy, the resources it could direct to that were very limited. And the region, the countries in the region, US allies in Asia, were well aware that they needed to take a bigger share of the burden of protecting the global commons and regional security and stability, including Japan, not being an exception in this. Now, 5 years on, which seems to be like an eternity now, the US is reducing its footprint in Middle East and Asia and North Africa. It's out of Afghanistan and is genuinely pivoting to the Indo-Pacific with all the accompanying resources that this entails. So doesn't that diminish, in a way, the incentives for Japan to pursue this enhanced role in the region, and perhaps maybe even encourages to revert back to the old lower key profile in security, especially military security? Or has the train really left the station and Tokyo is really determined to press ahead with actively shaping the trends in the Indo-Pacific? What is Japan's overall strategy in the Indo-Pacific? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to the very important panel. And you asked the question, the very core of Japan's strategy. Can I have 10 minutes? 10 to 12 minutes?
Absolutely. This is what you have.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's good. So, yeah, I prepared to explain Japan's strategic thinking, how to deal with rise of China and somehow U.S. Not determine the strategic position in the Indo-Pacific. As you pointed out, you wrote my old essays to the NATO Defense College. I'm glad you've read it. At that time, Japan was kind of lonely because not many the serious players are not so seriously considering China's assertive role, and also how important making a balance against rising power and make it stability in the region. And but now, good news is that now United States is sharing such an idea, and also the major countries such as Australia, India join us. And also the European countries join us somehow. And the Canadian too, by the way. What is the bad news? Bad news, it's not so bad news, but probably not so good news is still the US is not perfectly back in the region. Pivot, maybe, but maybe not. The reason is, you mentioned the US pivot. Who was a planner of a pivot? That was Kurt Campbell. In the Obama administration, he served the Assistant Secretary of State in East Asia and the Pacific. And currently, he's the National Security Council's Indo-Pacific coordinator. So, by the way, I've been a long-time friend of Kurt Campbell. So I worked in the Center for Strategic International Studies when the Kurt Campbell served the vice president. He has been working on how to strengthen the US-Japan alliance. I have been working on. In that sense, somehow we agree to the US-Japan alliance is not only for defense of Japan, rather whole regional stability in the Indo-Pacific region. So that's very important. And not so good news for Japan is US may be back, but not completely like US did in the Cold War or just after Cold War post era. Because US, the power is limited. US cannot exercise full power like the old days, the superpower, single power. Instead, Kurt Campbell wrote a very interesting piece to the Foreign Affairs website with his senior director for China. I think, their model is not the hegemonic stability of the United States, but balance of power. Like a model was a concert of Europe in 18th century and 19th century. That was a famous thesis written by Henry Kissinger. European balance of power. That means the major powers in Indo-Pacific, that's clearly the Australia, India, Japan, really need to work more hard, more seriously with the US to counterbalancing Chinese assertive action. So I think Japanese people are realizing Japan needs to play a larger role in security. So Japan's FOIP, free and open in the Pacific, is a kind of the combination of such kind of realism, that's geopolitics or military power. And however, to the subject, geoeconomics, liberal side, Japan really needs to contribute to the maintain a regional economic order, that trade, investment, and finance. And Japan still has been the third largest economy in the world. Japan used to be the second largest, but unfortunately now China is far beyond Japan's economic strength. But still Japan's economic role, especially setting up the regional rule, is very crucial. So again, in my previous the article in NATO Defense College, Japan needs European power. Why? European and the United States has been setting up a global liberal order after World War II. And not only Japan, but of course, India or Australia or China somehow are beneficial from such a stability and common regional rule. It seems to me China is now trying to get out from, or sometimes challenge the common rule, and in order to pursue their own interest. But the very important things is both in economy and politics. Our like-minded partners with the United States need to send a signal to the China would be the more happier with current economic and the regional rule. But it's not so easy to persuade rising power. For example, in the past, in the 1930s and the 40s, it was Japan who really broke the regional rule and eventually invaded China and the Pearl Harbor attack against the United States. So Japan knew. Sometimes it's very difficult for the rising power to be the self-restraint. But such a difficult work Japan and partners, especially the Australia, India, is very important. By the way, I'd like to have a very recent event. what happened in October? Probably the world are worried about China and Taiwan's relation. Many people worried about a potential warfare between Taiwan and China, and could be the war between US and China. Of course, nobody wants a war. However, some miscalculation is very risky. In October, what happened is Chinese People's Liberation Army aircraft violated Taiwan's air defense identification zone, as if. And I think October 2nd, 39 times. October 3rd, 55 times. October 4th, 56 times. That's largest. And in such assertive action, what Japan and the US and the European power and other allied powers is doing. In October 2nd and 3rd, Japan's self-defense forces, especially the helicopter carrier Ise, some people call the carrier, we call the destroyer. However, whatever, the joint the UK, New Zealand, Canada, including 2 US aircraft carrier and also UK's aircraft carrier now visiting in the Pacific, Queen Elizabeth. Where? Off the south coast of Okinawa. That's very close to Taiwan. And Okinawa is a place where US military base is located. So kind of the balancing act by the not only US, but the US and US military ally somehow made action. By the way, there's so many other practice with Indian military and Australian military, sometimes Indian Ocean, sometimes Pacific. I think such kind of activity, the kind of direction US is heading to. Again, US cannot deal with rise of China only with United States. That's big departure from unilateralism of George W. Bush's the single US can solve anything. Unfortunately, 9/11 terror and Afghanistan and Iraq war was somehow caused more trouble for the US is somehow wasting their power. And now US is focusing on more in the Indo-Pacific region. Why? Because that's center of US interest. First of all, if China control the Pacific, that's gonna be big trouble for the US's own territorial defense. We Japanese remember in 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, American people in the West Coast became very panic. Oh, Japanese Navy is coming to the offshore over West Coast. That was not true. But, you know, psychologically, US was not so secure if some enemy, potential enemy controlling the Pacific. That's one of the reasons. Very recent AUKUS framework. That's the cooperation between Australia, UK, and the United States, and promising providing the nuclear submarine to Australia. US is determined to control not only South China Sea, but the whole Pacific in their I mean the US and the US allied control. So that is very important. By the way, at the same time, economic order is a very important, economic rule is important. Recently, China suddenly opened, they would like to join a TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, that's a free trade agreement. Actually, US got out of TPP when US was led by Donald Trump. And Japanese former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe keep asking his friend Donald, come back to the TPP. But US didn't. And unfortunately, current administration, Biden is not showing, but that crucial moment. I think Japan and Australia clearly try to prevent China's participation. But other members of TPP may welcome China because China's market is attractive. It's time for US to come back. The US domestic politics is not so easier for the Biden administration to come back to. So such a kind of economic rule is very important too. By the way, the Japan somehow saved the TPP after Trump got out from TPP. And also Japan enacted the economic partnership agreement with the European Union. That was very important to saving the free trade regime. So again, let me conclude this. What Japan tried to do is realism, liberalism, try to the stability and the peace region and economic prosperity in the region. We believe that's good for the Chinese interest in the long term, but short term, very difficult to persuade. That's effort continues. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much indeed, Watanabe-san, for your very interesting kickoff remarks, and I really appreciated you weaving with historical perspective and contemporary, and also highlighting Japan's understanding of its responsibility for security in your region. In Estonia, where I am based, we frequently actually note the affinity with Japan when it comes to values such as rule of law, democracy, multilateralism and international norms. And in our recent report, the ICDS even on cyber policies, we identified this is an important ground for bilateral cooperation and common action. But admittedly, Japan has a somewhat different historical baggage when it comes to some of its neighbors and also some more distant parts of the Indo-Pacific. How is Tokyo managing this transition to a more active, maybe even slightly more muscular foreign policy when it comes to the sensitivities of some of your neighbors, and even, as I say, some of the countries even further in the Indo-Pacific? And this is why your historical perspective also is very important to note.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you may realize I didn't mention the name of South Korea. Even South Korea is a U.S. ally. So, believe me, personally, I joined the Japan-South Korea partnership, and clearly there's a common interest of South Korea and Japan. However, historical issues prevent to the smooth cooperation. And now, Joe Biden, US president, is seriously trying to reconcile between Japan and South Korea. But that's issue, clearly, history issue.
So we do still need American leadership to help sort things out, even not only in Europe, but also in your part of the world. I have being a moderator, I have a privilege of swapping a little bit around people in the order of appearance, and since there's certain kind of things that are brought up in the first intervention, I would like to actually now turn to Natasha Kassam, although she was last in the list of speakers. But I would like to turn to you now and say, well, in a recent article, you argued that the hype about China is beginning to project the impression that war is inevitable. You even wrote that, and I quote, hysteria couched in terms of preparing Australians for coming challenges actually works in Beijing's favor. It allows the threat of war itself to be used as a political tactic, and you listed a number of reasons how, or examples of how it is being done. So basically you claim that Beijing is happy to induce catastrophism in the political and societal discourses in our countries, and this is quite a strong case for toning things down a few notches, I would say. But wouldn't that create the impression, if we tone things down, that we are kowtowing to Beijing, and isn't this kind of a hype maybe necessary to draw attention to China's shenanigans and to maintain legitimacy of the costs incurred in countering those shenanigans? So, Natasha Kassam, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and it's a real pleasure to be a part of this dialogue, even remotely as it is. Now, you're absolutely right about what I wrote. That was back in April, for context, or perhaps even earlier, maybe in February. And what was happening at that moment was in Australia, there was this kind of feverish discussion about the idea of the drums of war beating. And this was coming from senior Australian officials who were essentially looking at China's behavior, particularly towards Taiwan, and saying, you know, our warriors need to be prepared to go overseas again. Now, fast forward a few months and you have what's happened in Afghanistan and Australia and other countries' withdrawal from there. You have the AUKUS announcement, and things look a little different from my perspective. What I was criticizing at that time was this kind of chest beating drum, you know, the drums of war, this kind of idea that this was inevitable, that we were going to end up in a very terrifying conflict in our region that has the potential to go nuclear, right? That what I was warning against was treating that as inevitable. I think a conflict of that nature should always be seen as the worst case scenario that all parties are seeking to avoid. Now, certainly that doesn't mean that we need to concede any ground to China. It doesn't mean that we need to go softly. What I think it means is we need to take the robust diplomatic and other measures now that can avoid those scenarios. Now, I think AUKUS is a pretty decent example of that. I think AUKUS is good policy, badly executed. And, you know, obviously I'm speaking to Europeans at the moment, so you'll understand why I think it was badly executed. And I couldn't agree more, but generally something like that, something which signals a willingness to play a long-term deterrent in our region, right? I think that is good for stability in our region and for avoiding that worst case scenario of a war. You know, we spoke a little bit about Taiwan, and suddenly, you know, a lot of my research focuses on Taiwan, and that is where, you know, as has already been said, there is kind of the worst case for conflict. And, you know, the kinds of capabilities and the kinds of language that are coming out of Australia now, I think are a little bit more cool and a little bit more rational, and do demonstrate that willingness to play a role, but without jumping to that worst case scenario. You jump to that worst case scenario and Australians are not going to come with you. You know, Australians do not want to be entangled in another messy conflict. They do not want to be entangled in a conflict with China, who, even though Australians are feeling very negatively about China, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit more, China is still Australia's largest trading partner. It has been for 13 years now. 40% of our exports go there, despite the coercive measures that Australia has been subject to. And so, you know, my concern is that by framing that conflict as inevitable, you actually will lose public support in Australia. You'll actually make people say, well, is Taiwan, you know, a place where 24 million people live in fear of invasion? Is that worth another war? And that is not the question I think we need to be asking. What I think we need to be asking is, what measures can we put in place right now to ensure that Taiwanese people remain free and that our region remains free from coercion?
Brilliant. I think this you highlighted this very well. I think the things are changing a little bit, and what we need to be careful with the discourse and agree. Well, recently my colleague noted that sometimes, you know, you get the impression that, you know, the US is just literally priming itself for a war with China, but we shouldn't forget that there are still multiple dependencies with China, and China is important. So a confrontation should not be leading to a major conflict. But you mentioned AUKUS as well, and then now, you know, we are here in Europe. Let's talk about AUKUS a little bit. Let's dwell on it a little bit. Well, that puts France out into cold a little bit. Rejigged quite a bit the system of alliances and coalitions, although UK and US are quite traditional allies of Australia in any way, and also will make Australia one of the few countries that adopts nuclear energy for military purposes. But now, how do you think this configuration, AUKUS, will shape the geopolitics of Indo-Pacific in the coming decades? And what does that really spell for your relations with Europe? Because although there was quite a silence from many European capitals to Paris's outburst and outrage, France is influential in the European Union and has ways to obstruct and block and vent their anger and then take a revenge on Australia. How do you think this will shape your relations with the European Union, with Europe in the future as well?
Yeah, look, I think that's a great question. And like I said, I think AUKUS was, ultimately the right decision, but not done in the right way. One of the reasons it wasn't done in the right way was that obviously France was not sufficiently consulted, nor other European partners. But it's also true that there was very little discussion or consultation in our region. And perhaps from my perspective, most importantly, there was no discussion in Australia. There was no parliamentary debate. There was no consideration of whether Australia making this very significant decision to have nuclear-powered submarines, whether that was in our national interest. This was, our last submarine contract was the subject of a very protracted, messy discussion in the Australian public. And this time it was nothing, it was done in the dead of the night. So I think there are many questions about the way it was handled. In terms of what it means for relations with Europe, I think that I do think ultimately, as is often the case in foreign policy, pragmatism will prevail. So I do think that we will be able to get past this kind of messiness. I think, for example, the Australia-EU free trade agreement negotiations will proceed eventually, even though France is not particularly happy with them. I also think when we, I won't speak for France, but looking at France's Indo-Pacific strategy, it certainly wasn't only about a submarine deal with Australia. There were many, many reasons driving that strategy. And if something like this deal is enough to knock that over, then we have to question the kind of substance behind it in the first place. One thing that I do think is perhaps, at least in my part of the world, overlooked, we talk a lot about the idea of Australia preparing to play a different kind of role in the region and more projection than they've been willing to do in the past. And we talk about, in Australia, there's a lot of concern that we've perhaps outsourced our kind of strategic debate. We're not going to be able to run these submarines without the United States. And so does it make our foreign policy kind of too intertwined? Those are all very fair questions. But what I would say is perhaps overlooked is that for the longest time, Australia and other countries in our region have worried, as Watanabe-san mentioned, about the United States' staying power in the region, whether the pivot is real and genuine and carries a lot of weight behind it. And perhaps what we don't pay enough attention to is, I think, through AUKUS, through this very long-term commitment to Australia having this capability, it is yet another way to anchor the United States in the region and to, double down on that commitment. And ultimately, not everyone in the region has welcomed the decision, but I do think they'll see the value of that, even if they think the other costs are too large. So that's where I kind of come down on the AUKUS question, but it is also still early days. The submarines are only a small part, we're told, of the entire agreement, and there's still very little information available about what it means. So a lot of people in Australia are saying all it means is that we have no submarines at all.
Indeed, it's a much broader range of questions covered. And being in the Baltics, I really feel Australia's concern about and share this concern about getting more America in your region. This is very much the concern over here as well. But let me turn now to Ambassador Wadhwa, and India is a giant of the Indo-Pacific. It has a long tradition of non-alignment, but also quite fraught relations with China as well. And in a way, when I was thinking about it, in a way, India to me is like a Finland of the South, just with the nukes and somewhat more populous. However, your country is involved in such frameworks as Quad, and you noted in your recent article that now security is very much what really currently galvanizes this format, this particular grouping. But it's not a formal alliance and probably will never be. So Delhi, as you highlighted in your article, is mostly keen on enhancing functional cooperation across a range of areas such as technology governance, pandemic management, cyber and space security, supply chains resilience, military exercises, and so on. But can India really play a pivotal role in shaping the dynamics in the Indo-Pacific without entering some formal security and defense pacts with other key players, and thus remaining largely transactional in the future? Or is the day looming when Delhi will have to make more specific and solid commitments that remove uncertainty about how India will act in a major crisis and will increase its credibility as a major power in the region? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I think you've asked a very fundamental question relating to Indian foreign and security policy. And as you rightly said, it is not in India's nature to enter into security alliances, and that has continued over the years. You rightly pointed out the policy that we follow of non-alignment. That, of course, has been changed now. It's a policy of interests where we work with partners on specific issues that come up from time to time. And that takes care of the security aspects as well. There's that fundamental change which has happened in Indian foreign and security policy over the last 2 or 3 decades, and it's been evolving constantly. And that is why we have joined this grouping of the Quad quite willingly, with the United States, Australia, and Japan. Now, obviously, this has happened because of the scenario which has been played out in the Indo-Pacific as far as the balance of power is concerned and the economic activity which has shifted to this region. And of course, it's also in response to China's economic, political, and military expansion. Now, if you see whether it's the Western Pacific or Australia or Japan, or the line of actual control on the Indo-Chinese border, and that's what concerns India the most. The Indo-Pacific is facing the brunt of China's aggression. The way we see it here is that it's an unjustified, policy of territorial claims, and also policies which are aimed at cornering resources. So, for example, China has continued with occupation and artificial creation of islands, their militarization in disputed waters in the South China Sea. There have been regular incidents of denial of fishing, passage, and drilling in territorial waters which are claimed by ASEAN countries. That has intensified. And these territorial claims are advanced on specious historical grounds when the UNCLOS is actually clearly defined international law with regard to territorial claims. Also, many countries, including India, see the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative as actually a disturbing expansion of Chinese dominance because the initiative itself is opaque. It has stoked concerns about high levels of debt and Chinese control, which leads on to acquisition of strategic infrastructure like ports and airports. And many of these are located on the periphery of India. Sri Lanka is a prime example. So we also see in the future the objective of preserving Chinese economic motives is bound to increase the role of the Chinese PLA and the Navy, which in turn will drive and exacerbate insecurity amongst other regional and outside powers who have a stake in the Indo-Pacific. So as we see it, a special requirement as far as India is concerned to be able to counter this. If we do not do it through a military alliance, then how do we do it? And for us, the Quad is moving in the right direction because it has expanded quite quickly upon its initiatives of, let's see, the production and rollout of the vaccines, for example, in the Indo-Pacific. It's a very practical area of cooperation where India will play an important role in the manufacture of these vaccines. And then some important initiatives have been announced for decarbonizing shipping and port operations, employment of clean hydrogen technology, and also in critical and in emerging technologies in partnership with industry. The Quad is advancing the deployment of secure and transparent 5G and beyond 5G networks, and also working to promote innovation and what we call trustworthy vendors. So by 2022, they will work to demonstrate the scalability and cybersecurity of open and standards-based technology. Not only that, then the Quad is also moving towards mapping of the supply chain of some critical technologies and materials, and that includes things like semiconductors, and that's being done through a semiconductors supply chains initiative. It's also set up some contact groups on advanced communications and artificial intelligence, which again focuses on standards. And there's a Quad statement now on principles on technology design, on development and governance and use. And we believe here in India that this will guide not just the region, but also the world towards a more responsible and open and what we call high standards innovation. Now, infrastructure is one such area where India is particularly concerned because of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which seems to be, expanding regularly in our neighborhood in particular, especially the Indian Ocean region. So here, the Quad has paid particular attention to infrastructure, and again, it will provide a high standards infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific. I'm sure in the coming year, it'll come out with a financing mechanism, which is very important to counter the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative in the region. One very other important development that's happened is in space, where the grouping has decided to identify new collaboration opportunities and also to share satellite data for peaceful uses, but most importantly, on responding to challenges in shared domains. So I think the maritime security aspect will be reinforced by this initiative. And you mentioned about security in particular. So let me point out that with the inclusion of Australia in the Malabar naval exercises, in my opinion, the security and interoperability element, which is so important for maritime security of the Quad, has already been hived off from the grouping's ongoing regular activities, while the information sharing network between the grouping continues to be refined and improved. In other words, both of these are proceeding in parallel. I just wanted to say something on the AUKUS because that came up for discussion as well. And I think the AUKUS with Australia, US, and UK as partners, of course, mentions developing joint nuclear propulsion submarine capability, but also picks up on cybersecurity, on artificial intelligence, on quantum communications. And while the nuclear submarines may be some years away, I think these are the important areas on which work will proceed, and it will, in our opinion, complement the work of the Quad. So as part of this defense arrangement with the US, UK, and Australia, very importantly, it will protect the undersea fiber optic cables that provide part of the military and civilian communication, which will not allow countries like China to tap into these cables, eavesdrop, or to collect data through cyber means. And also the quantum communication technologies that has been talked about would allow new types of encryptions, and thus that would make eavesdropping obsolete. Artificial intelligence and machine learning applications will allow detection of known cyber threats to undersea cables as well. So now all these issues have been discussed in the Quad context in the working groups. So it's an overlapping kind of process in my view, and both will mutually reinforce each other. It's just that the formal security aspect has been taken care of by the formation of the AUKUS. And so, I don't see any conflict, I just feel that these two groupings will actually work towards complementing each other in the future. So for us, as far as India is concerned, The border issue is the most important with China. There are regular incursions which are happening over the past 2 years now. Even as we speak, there is an ongoing confrontation and a standoff in a couple of places. And that's become a way of life here, the way we live here in India as far as China is concerned. The security aspects is very important for us here in India. But I think, India has successfully, negotiated what to do with the Chinese in that respect, and has responded equally strongly to what has been offered and dished out to us.
Yes, thank you very much, Ambassador Wadhwa. I think you highlighted very well how rich the agenda of Quad is, and how actually far it has moved from the origins of Quad itself in terms of the ground being covered and so on. And I'm thankful that you highlighted that, there's the border issues now for you so important, and I think in your article you also put it very straightforwardly: Quad or not Quad, this is something that India will have to deal by itself with, not with somebody else's help. But there's another piece of landlocked, so inland, away from the ocean, that I'm curious about and to hear your perspective about. US left Afghanistan, saying it was a distraction from focusing on countering China. Now China is moving into Afghanistan to fill in the void, exploit the opportunities that open up there. How do you see this episode from Delhi? Was Washington too narrow-minded when making such moves, or conscious of the risk and accepting it? And where does this abandonment of Afghanistan now leave India, given that Pakistan and China are likely to call the shots in Kabul?
So it was quite well known for some time now. Both Trump administration and the Biden administration had made it very well known that the United States were wanting to withdraw from Afghanistan. I think what has happened is that the process of withdrawal has not been managed well. And as far as Afghanistan is concerned, I would see this as an overall failure of US policy. And I say this because, the US has gone against all its declared principles and values in handing over the country to the Taliban, giving a fillip to religious radicalism and terrorism in the region. And this could have been avoided by having an agreement which would have allowed a transition, an orderly transition in Afghanistan, if only there was some patience, and if only some more attention had been paid to what would happen once the withdrawal takes place. Now, as you know, since the US withdrawal, you also had a withdrawal of NATO countries, and you had a withdrawal of all other allies of the United States from the country. The result is there for everybody to see. You have, a group of people who are ruling the country, but they're controlled by the ISI in Pakistan and by the military in Pakistan. It's not an inclusive government. There is no guarantee of women's rights or human rights in the country. And the people of Afghanistan are actually suffering. Now the UN is trying to find ways and means of trying to put some liquidity into the system, which will happen, but it's a very difficult process. And there's no guarantee at the end of this that there would be any kind of democracy which would return to Afghanistan. So that's the situation we are in. I think the Taliban, India has expressed lots of concerns about the Taliban government not being inclusive, nor is it a government which has promised that its territory will not be used as a base for terrorism. And of course, we reflected this in our joint statement with the United States soon after the withdrawal, when the Prime Minister met with President Biden during his visit to the US. And also, I think what is the most worrying aspect of this is that the investments from India have been up to $3 billion US, and we have built 500 projects in Afghanistan. When there was elected government in Afghanistan. Now, all this, of course, is not going to waste. It's going to be there for Afghanistan and for the people to use, because it consists of roads, the power lines, the dam, there's a parliament building, etc., which will continue to exist. And it has earned the goodwill of the Afghan people, but it's up to whoever rules Afghanistan now, whether they will preserve what has been built for them, and whether they will put this to good use for their own people. We don't see that happening in the short term because it's a very pessimistic scenario because of the way this whole issue has been handled.
Thank you very much for these answers. Before I open floor to the questions from our audience, I wanted to discuss with all three of you one particular aspect, and with 3 out of 4 corners of the Quad covered in this panel, let's consider what is in between them. To borrow the title of Rory Stewart's book, In the Places in Between. This Indo-Pacific space really packs populous giants like India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Philippines, and midgets like Palau or Nauru, all with their interests, perceptions, fears, and concerns. How do we ensure that this space does not become, to use the title of another book by historian Timothy Snyder, the Bloodlands, in this increasing confrontation with China? Some of those countries are not entirely happy to see where the things are heading and how long-standing multilateral frameworks like ASEAN are being marginalized by the new fashions in coalition making. Others are openly aligning themselves with Beijing. Can Quad or any other configuration, Trans-Pacific Partnership was mentioned, offer an attractive alternative in terms of economic cooperation, investments, trade opportunities, technology governance to China's Belt and Road Initiative? What do you think? Let's maybe start with Watanabe-san.
Okay, thank you. Very important question and very difficult question. First of all, China's Belt and Road Initiative somehow successful, but not fully successful somehow. Like the debt trap issue, especially the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka was a case, but that doesn't deny whole China's effort to invest to for example, the regional investment for the infrastructure. Investor Wadhwa stressed somehow infrastructure investment was very attractive to all the players in the Indo-Pacific. That's clear. And for recipient, who pay doesn't matter so much, except the serious trouble, like debt trapped one. So US pay, Japan pay, China pay, doesn't matter somehow. So that's one side. However, the other side is how such the activity could be the sustainable. Sustainable means once attractive, but if such the investment could not continue, that's trouble. One case, very recently, the China helped a lot to the high-speed railway in Malaysia. That was a competition between Japan and China. Malaysia took China because offer was very attractive. However, it turned to be the much higher cost than China offered. Big trouble is now the waiting for the Malaysia, for example. So, competition is a good. Competition is maybe China's Belt and Road and the alternative competition. Somehow Japan offered a better deal to Malaysia. Malaysia didn't take it. But from now on, if Malaysia have another opportunity to get, for example, competition between Japan's offer and China's offer, Malaysia and other players who watch the case of Malaysia consider, maybe China's price is cheaper, but the quality may not be. So again, it's not so wise to turn down the China's effort. We appreciate China's effort too. We need a better investment, better infrastructure. However, competition is important, and the freedom of choice is important. That's considering a combination of a regional rule in economy and also security both in the region.
Thank you. Yes, the very, very important thoughts. And Natasha, Kassam, what do you think? Can Quad Plus offer a really attractive alternative and become the center of gravity or sort of attraction to those places in between, countries in between that are often torn between big opportunity, and big promise of China and the Quads, or the democratic, liberal, rule of law based multilateralist camp that is embodied by Quad?
Look, I am not sure that the Quad wants to be that center of gravity, maybe, but you'll notice every time the Quad speaks, they talk a lot of, for example, about ASEAN centrality or the importance of the East Asia Forum. And I don't think the Quad is trying to replace any of these existing mechanisms, but try to complement them. But maybe to come at it in a slightly different way, from my perspective, if we identify what are the trends that are actually leading us to this place of instability and insecurity in our region, right? To my mind, there's three key factors. There's first, the increasing ambitions, confidence, and resources of China, right? Obviously. The second, I think, is the return of state-led approaches in economics and the way in which the US-China rivalry is really normalizing the use of economics as a matter of national security. So what I mean by that is that as Beijing and Washington come to perceive more and more economic domains like trade or technology or education as matters that touch on their broader national interests, each government is demonstrating an increasing willingness to intervene in markets to advance those national security objectives. And then the third key trend, I think, that is causing this is public opinion and populism, which is really fueling both protectionism and confrontation. So these three forces, I think, are making it more attractive and more legitimate for states to wield power over markets in this way. And so here in Australia, of course, we've been at the forefront of this kind of economic coercion, although it's not always, Europeans know it's not always just Beijing, right? Washington does this as well. But here in Australia, we've been subjected to 18 months of protracted economic coercion from China, who is also our largest trading partner. And so when I think about what chance we have in terms of trying to preserve some security, make the region inclusive, ensure that India's interests are accommodated as well as Palau's interests. The way I see it is that on the security questions, on things like AUKUS, Quad, on those issues, I think we're working very hard at balancing China's power, and a lot of different states are working together in different ways to do that. Just last week, there was a very significant military exercise near Japan that had, American aircraft carriers, Japanese, New Zealand, I think Dutch boats like that, and then they moved into Singapore and were working with Singapore and Malaysia. So on the military and security side, I think we can see to some success, balancing coalitions emerging. On geoeconomics, I think it is much, much harder. In Australia's case, we've had constant support from Washington in rhetoric, right? Lots of speech saying that we need to cooperate with allies and partners to ensure that we have supply chain resilience, or that we, stand with countries like Australia or in the past Japan, who have been subject to this kind of economic coercion. But there's very little that's actually been done. And, there are a few reasons for that. Partly it's because when governments intervene in markets, it creates winners and losers. So when China is coercing Australian coal producers, one of the winners of that is American coal miners. And it makes it very challenging when states want to cooperate. They can't necessarily and shouldn't necessarily control what their companies do. And so I think that's really difficult. But the other reason that it's really difficult to combat these geoeconomic tensions is that most of this kind of coercive economic statecraft, they violate the rules-based order. We say China is breaking the rules. In order to counter that, in many ways, we also then would need to break the rules that we claim to stand for. And so I think that's why the geopolitical side, I think a lot of that cooperation is working. A lot of the new unilaterals and various shapes of different arrangements are working quite well. But the geoeconomic side, I think, is still really struggling. We're still struggling to counter the appeal and size of China's market. And just, one example to finish on that I think to me, it was really kind of interesting. Of course, we talk a lot about US-China strategic competition. And isn't it fascinating that on the same day you see AUKUS announced, right? A huge military, and of course, all the other areas that were mentioned by Ambassador Wadhwa, cooperation. On the same day, you see China applying to join the CPTPP, which the United States, frankly, will not be able to come back to, I would say, anytime soon. So even though we're competing, you could argue we're on different playing fields, right? One is in the economic area and one is in the security area. That's oversimplifying, of course, but I just think it's interesting to see that we're not necessarily competing in the same territories. And I think that's where the real challenge is going to be going forward.
Yeah, thank you, Natasha. Kassam, as you say, in the times like these, everything is national security. Even the sales of very nice, very excellent Australian wine become a matter of national security. So it is important to highlight that geoeconomics now is a very complex and complicated field. But Ambassador Wadhwa, I sensed from your talk that you do see opportunities for Quad Plus and for engaging countries in this Indo-Pacific space through the mechanisms and incentives that are being developed as part of this format. What are your thoughts on this? Yep, we don't have the sound. You need to unmute yourself.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I tend to agree with the general line of thinking of Natasha, because she's a realist and I'm also a realist in that sense. I know that it's not possible to achieve things that you always think about or dream about. But I would go a little further than her to say that as far as the Quad is concerned, it has already thought long and hard and discussed a lot about the alternatives that could be found for countering the Belt and Road Initiative of China. That can only be done if you have alternate sources of funding. I see three issues here going forward. One is, of course, there is a Blue Dot network, which has been put forward initially between Australia and United States and Japan. For this to go forward, I think you'll have to have acceptance of standards across the board and acceptance of standards by the country who received the projects. That's also important because many countries don't want to do that. They don't want to be shackled by high standards and they want to be very flexible about that. And China has taken full advantage of that situation. They want cheap funding. Secondly, you need to have a proper funding mechanism. Now, when 3 or 4 countries are working together, that makes it that much harder to put together this mechanism unless you have a pooling of resources in one particular place, which actually then negotiates and doles out the money. So that will have to be worked upon very quickly. Otherwise, we will just be talking in circles. We've had a G7 initiative of B3W. That's an idea which can progress further, but of course that's a G7 idea, and how the Quad adapts to it going forward is a big question. Perhaps they can take that into account in the funding mechanism in projects. It's not as if the Quad is not worked together. For example, India and Japan have worked in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and in Myanmar on joint projects. That's happened. But I'm saying that when you talk of 4 countries pooling resources, it can only be financial. And then there will have to be someone who will have to execute it. So that arrangement has to be worked out. There has to be a division of responsibilities. For example, Australia and United States will have to focus in the Western Pacific, for example, and Japan in ASEAN, and India perhaps in the Indian Ocean countries like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, etc., which we are already doing. So it's not an impossible task, but it requires tremendous amount of cooperation and working out the arrangements. The Quad is currently now spelling out a number of areas of concern and has set up a number of working groups to look into those, or contact groups for that matter. But unless it concentrates on what is really important and picks up one or two projects which can succeed and deliver, you will not have that acceptance in countries in Southeast Asia or in ASEAN, who would rather not wait for a very long time to get cheap funding, which is available from Chinese institutions, for example. So that's the whole issue here. And currently there's a lot of attention being paid to how to overcome that particular issue.
Thank you. Thank you for it's your experience and knowledge as a practitioner in the field of diplomacy really shines through. I really appreciate highlighting very practical things that have to be done, or the limits of them in this regard. We have a few questions already on Slido, but the way I see now before I move to them, I have one question myself as well, which we haven't touched really, and I wouldn't be the Baltic if I didn't raise it. If I didn't ask about the outsized buffer state between the feisty Baltics and assertive China, and that is Russia. Russia is a Pacific power. It has a complex and sometimes complicated relations with some of the countries, such as Japan and in India. And at the same time, it is forging this ever closer relationship and even alliance, maybe I would call alliance of unequals with China. And knowing Russia's modus operandi to create some massive problem and then come with some handy solution that resolves it and then locks in Russia's gains, it is bound to do the same in the Indo-Pacific. What are your expectations and concerns when it comes to Russia in the Indo-Pacific? For example, India, according to Ashley Tellis, a senior fellow at Carnegie Endowment, India is eager to offer Moscow engagement with Quad as an alternative to close alliance with China. And would that really pay off, or is it a really dangerously naive assumption? So what are your thoughts on Russia? Again, maybe start with Watanabe-san.
That's a very difficult question, especially for Japan. Probably for India, a little bit easier. But, we mean the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, the organization I belong to, is doing a dialogue, trilateral dialogue between Japan, India, and Russia. Because we know India, Russia has a kind of a closer relation. And sometimes very good to the counterbalancing against China, somehow. Of course, that's probably Baltic countries are not so happy with this, I know. But you know what? I think a trouble is, we face a face of a dragon, only see the tail of a bear. And, Baltic countries facing the bear's face, but only see the tail of a dragon. So, but sometimes because of this, cooperation is very important somehow. And
different perspective indeed. India was mentioned, so maybe Ambassador Wadhwa, what are your thoughts on Russia subject? You probably need to unmute yourself again, if you could.
Thank you. Sorry. I think Watanabe-san touched upon a very contemporary subject of trilateral cooperation between Japan, India, and Russia. I think what is happening in geopolitics today is that there is, because of the sanctions that are imposed on Russia, it's looking for partners who can support it. And obviously, China is under pressure as well. So therefore, both of them tend to support each other as far as possible, and they tend to stick together. So I would say, in a sense, that Russia is being driven into the arms of China, the way we look at it from India. This has also come out in conversations with the Russians, who keep complaining about the fact that the United States, of course, they say it's for the wrong reasons of interference in the United States elections, etc. But also, as far as Europe is concerned, that there is a group of countries in Europe who would not allow progress to go forward because of historical reasons or because of their recent actions, which has happened in Ukraine, etc. Now, of course, one can argue on those points, but that's the current situation geopolitically. Russia is not very happy with China's influence in the Russian Far East. It's a sparsely populated region. It's got a lot of natural resources, and the Chinese have encroached regularly into that area as well. So you mentioned about an unequal partnership. Russians would not accept that, of course. They don't accept the fact that they're junior partners because they feel that they're aiding China equally as much as China is aiding them by mutual support. But this trilateral cooperation between Japan, India, and Russia has been an idea which has been formally mooted after discussions with Japan and India, and the Russians are open to this issue. Now, as you know, there is also an island dispute between Japan and Russia, and a cooperation framework or a relationship which involves Japan in the Russian Far East and also India, of course, would be, very important in respect of growing that relationship and making it smoother for both Japan and for Russia. As far as India is concerned, it's already invested in the Russian Far East, especially in oil. And going forward, we have a project, which would bring in, oil and gas from the region into India and then take back goods, but it's awaiting the clearance of a shipping line which can operate profitably. So that's where we are at the moment. And I know that looking at it from, like Watanabe's son said, looking at it from the Baltics perspective, it doesn't seem as if it's something which is right. But here in this part of the world, we always feel that unless we tend to cooperate, we will always have conflicts. And we try to do our best to, live with the situation and try to solve it.
Thank you for the wise words. And Natasha, Kassam, have the Russians made it down under? Are they messing around? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, perhaps you'll be unsurprised to hear that Australia does not focus very much on Russia as a general rule. Now, it's interesting to hear you obviously very fairly describe Russia as a Pacific power, because Russia doesn't feature in Australia's Indo-Pacific strategy and isn't considered really as an Indo-Pacific power from Australia's perspective. Having said that, we have, I would say, quite a famously negative relationship with Russia. Our former Prime Minister 7 years ago famously said that he would shirt front Putin following the downing of MH17. And I think many editors and diplomats around the world were frantically calling Canberra to understand what on earth shirt front meant. But, an Australian term to take him to task. So, we have a, historically quite poor relationship, and generally in kind of Australian official terms, the focus has been on what has happened in Crimea, what happened to MH17, and potential interference in elections. So those are all quite negative. The one thing I would say is that perhaps because of that quite negative relationship, I think Australia does overlook some of the very small areas in which our interests could potentially align. And one of those is in Antarctica, where Russia is a player, China is a player, Australia is a very major player. And it's possible that Australian and Russian interests in Antarctica are aligned less than they are with China's. And I think the potential for working together, I don't even want to say cooperation, but the potential for, coming together to counter some of China's efforts in Antarctica is not really even considered because of the relationship that we have. And so, there's perhaps scope to do things a little differently there, but at the moment, there's really no evidence of that happening in Australia.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And actually that ties in smoothly with a couple of the questions I have online from the viewers. And I'll take them both together because they're very similar. NATO. Well, NATO has been, as I mentioned in introductory remarks, building global partnerships, including with Australia, including with Japan, at the same time, it's not willing so much to get into this China business. It knows that it is a challenge, but not yet in the military realm. It's more technological, geoeconomic challenge to North Atlantic Alliance. But what are the expectations, perhaps, as to what kind of a role, what position NATO should take in the Indo-Pacific, including perhaps maybe what kind of a reaction or how they could sort of tie in with the AUKUS alliance or partnership and so on. So how do you see NATO's role, if you see any role for NATO in the Indo-Pacific? And again, probably I'll start with Watanabe-san.
Thank you very much. I think clearly the NATO give us means Japan and as a U.S. allied partner in the Indo-Pacific region of legitimacy which created through the history of Cold War and post-Cold War too, somehow. History is different between European history and Asian history, and the development stage of states are different, and the big difference is the nature of China and Russia too. So I think, for example, Quad cannot be NATO type because all are different, and that's good somehow. We have our own cooperation style. Clearly NATO is already the existing framework who achieved a lot, especially the defeating Soviet Union somehow and promoting a democracy and the prosperity in whole Europe. So, such kind of things, historical achievement was legitimacy and of course common rule too. For example, very recently, Japan's defense spending is the debate because Japan has a new government now. Japan spends just 1% of GDP, and the NATO rule is GDP the 2% of GDP. And somehow some Japanese people said, "Oh, now Japan to consider about 2% of GDP." That's too much, by the way. But anyway, we are watching U.S. U.S. alliance. The other side of alliance, always learning a process, learning a lesson from NATO. So that's also somehow Japan-NATO cooperation is very, very helpful, at least such kind of things.
Yes, thank you very much. Perhaps Natasha, Kassam, another global partner of NATO?
Yeah, I mean, of course, Australia has provided support to NATO missions previously, but I think when we look at the role that Australia sees potentially for close cooperation with NATO in the Indo-Pacific, I think it's probably not military. I don't think that that's what Australia is looking for. We saw the NATO Secretary General at the beginning of the year call out China's bullying of Australia. That those kinds of symbolic gestures, I think, matter quite a lot to Australia. But I think going forward, what we're already seeing between Australia and Europe in terms of focusing on the Indo-Pacific and with NATO as well is work on protecting critical infrastructure, work on cyber, working on foreign interference. I think these are the kinds of areas that it makes the most sense for NATO, Australia and regional partners to be collaborating on. And ultimately, I think that will have a role in the kind of balance of power that we manage to form here. So I think looking forward, it's going to be quite a different kind of relationship, at least in our region. I think that's to be expected. But given the movement by quite a few different NATO allies, as well as the Secretary General, I do think it's kind of slowly moving in that direction.
Yeah, thank you. And Ambassador Wadhwa, what is the India's position? Is NATO getting in the Indo-Pacific makes things a little too crowded for your field?
Well, I think if you'd asked me that question 2 decades ago, I would have said NATO doesn't have to be here at all. But Indian foreign policy has evolved much more since then, and actually, the more hands on deck, the better it is, given the threat that China poses today to all the countries of the region. So I think NATO certainly should have a role to play here, and they should work together with the Quad countries, with AUKUS going forward. There are issues like cybersecurity, new technologies, the 5G issue and beyond 5G issue, technology theft, etc. All these are of interest to NATO, and planning for what Europe should be prepared for going forward is part of NATO's job and policy, and they should concentrate on that.
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed. I have one more question in the online, but before that, I want to turn maybe to the physical audience here. Is maybe somebody has any question from those present over here? If I don't see any hands, then maybe let's maybe then consider one question I have before I get this online question, which actually is a good one to wrap the session overall. But my question is related to my kind of one of the issues or set of issues that is very dear to me as well, is addressing the climate change challenge. And now with the UN Climate Change Conference coming up very soon, I started looking up where the Indo-Pacific nations stand and where they are in addressing this truly existential challenge to entire humanity. And most of those nations are not really trailblazers in decarbonization and climate neutrality ambitions, at least stated once. And according to the 2021 scorecard by the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, only Japan has climate neutrality goals set in law. But just by 2050, and in Australia and in India, there is only an ongoing discussion to set such a goal by 2050 and 2060 respectively. So indeed, in the meantime, the impression in Europe is that all three seem to be quite keen on fossil fuels as well. With this conference approaching, is there any chance that some of your nations at least will do more to show leadership, sense of urgency, perhaps commitment in addressing this challenge, or are the costs seen as too prohibitive and maybe solidarity from other major players too much lacking and society is too reluctant? What is the perspective from your part of the world? I'll probably start with Natasha Kassam.
I suspect you're starting with me because I have the unfortunate responsibility to stump up and, be completely embarrassed in a European audience by Australia's quite atrocious efforts to combat climate change. But to answer your question, I think that Australia has been a laggard for some time on climate change policy. It feels exposed more now than ever because we've had, our closest friends in the world say out loud that they want us to do better. So that external international pressure as well as domestic pressure is building. I do think Australia will announce its net zero target before COP26, probably for 2050. But as we all know, that's not good enough anymore. And what we need is stronger 2030 targets, and that won't happen, or it is unlikely to happen. I will say the kind of one upside or perhaps spot of positivity I can offer is that all of the states and territories of Australia have set net zero targets, and Australian businesses, including fossil fuel businesses, are very aware of the need to make their businesses resilient into the future. 70% of Australia's coal and gas exports go to countries that have set net zero targets. Like, Australia realizes that its economy has to fundamentally shift in the future. We are just being very slow to get there, and for that, I personally am very sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Indeed, it's a fundamental shift, and for the giant like India, that would be a very, very hard and maybe long-term shift. Ambassador Wadhwa, what are the thoughts in Delhi on climate change and responding to it?
I think contrary to what the impression is in Europe, some years ago, maybe there was some sort of reluctance as far as India is concerned to look at issues of climate change in all seriousness, because our stand was on, the funding for mitigation. And Now, under the current government, since 2014, there's been a sea change in thinking as far as climate change is concerned. In fact, India is going to be perhaps the only developing country which will meet its goals of alternate energy by 2030. There is also a target of emission intensity reduction by 33% by 2030. So that's well on track. The emphasis on solar and alternate sources of energy, that's also proceeding quite well. And I think you might be knowing that India, along with France, has also launched the International Solar Alliance, which has got a big membership now. The membership keeps growing. So that's going to be a focus for the government going forward, as much as possible on solar energy, because India is quite blessed with solar energy. Already we have hydro energy to fall back on. And so the alternate sources of energy are going to be a focus. As far as fossil fuels are concerned, I think that's currently under big discussion because there's general shortage of energy in India. We are net importers, as you know, of oil and gas, and coal is an alternate source of energy. We import a lot of coal from countries like Australia, for instance. So there's a mutual, meeting of interests over there, at least with the current government in Australia. But there is a big rethink on, whether we should actually expand any more the production of domestic coal and reduce the import of coal and depend on other sources of energy. So there are practical things happening on the ground. And I see a big shift in our stance on climate change.
Thank you. This is very good to know. Turning to Watanabe-san, Japan, given its technological prowess and also energy dependency on energy imports, and but also given that you've enshrined in law your climate neutrality goals, maybe it's an opportunity for Tokyo also to show a greater leadership in the entire Indo-Pacific when it comes to climate change?
Yes. Yes, means clearly Japan has been seriously working on the leadership for the climate change in earlier stage with Europe. That's at the old days in Kyoto Protocol. And at that time, Japan and the EU somehow was a world leader. Unfortunately, we are so disappointed United States was dropped out, like a TPP. However, now the Obama administration was a turning point to the US is trying to come back, and the US really needed to China and India together because world largest and the second and the third emitter of carbon. So that's clearly the Japan's somehow the leadership initiative. Try include US, China, India, put in a framework on somehow the reduction of carbon. Of course, Japan is also struggling. You didn't mention one trouble for Japan is Japan is experienced a serious nuclear plant accident in Fukushima. And very difficult for the Japanese to restart several suspended nuclear power. Without dependency on the nuclear power, very difficult to attain ambitious goal for the carbon zero in 2050. However, very difficult for the political leader to have a consensus to restart resuming the nuclear powers. So that's big political challenge. But somehow the advantage and the disadvantage together. And we need to also consider climate change is an existential threat for the Pacific Island nations. That's serious. And we have a collaboration and a conversation with them. And unfortunately, their voices are relatively small. However, Japan is also island nations too. And somehow some common incentive to work on this. So again, working with Europe is a very key to attain the goal. And of course, Ambassador Wadhwa pointed out several new technology like a hydrogen energy or this kind of type. And somehow the Quad also good platform to develop such kind of things. So, we are facing a serious issue. So we need try to everything, every framework, transatlantic, Japan, EU, and Quad, and such kind of things. It's time to consider because it's a serious one, getting serious.
Thank you very much indeed, and our time is almost up. And I had one question hanging up in online space, but I'll try to turn it into an opportunity for you to wrap up this excellent session and maybe share your first. What are your biggest fears about the developments in the Indo-Pacific? What's the worst case scenario? Of course, is a war, a major war, but maybe falling short of that. What would be your biggest concern? And what are the sources of optimism for you when it comes to the development of the Indo-Pacific? And I'll start now, probably in the reverse order from Ambassador Wadhwa, and then moving on to Natasha and Watanabe-san.
So I think I'll start with the positive aspect first. I think because of the Chinese policies, there's been a conscious thinking on the part of other countries in the region towards cooperation. And that has thrown up a lot of new ideas which would not have materialized otherwise. And we've seen that, as far as the Quad grouping is concerned and the bilaterals that, countries in the Quad will have with the ASEAN countries going forward. This will also happen with the Western Pacific countries, I'm sure. And there will be much more attention paid to the cooperation development angle in the region. Now, the threat, of course, is you said it quite clearly. I don't see that that this is an imminent issue, but things could get worse if the Chinese continue with the policies that they're doing at the moment, which is not in keeping with the rule of law. Unfortunately, China is a member of the UN Security Council, and anything that the Chinese do, we cannot hold them accountable. It will be vetoed down when it comes to grave threats to international peace and security. Otherwise, I think it's only a question of what will happen in China internally. And that's the hope going forward, that this will calm down. There'll be some amount of adjustment as far as the outside world is concerned, and the aggressive policies will come to rest, in which case the region, which is a promise of a region which will do well in the future, this trend should continue. But at the moment, I'm looking a little pessimistically at this adversarial relationship which is developing between US and China on the one hand, and also between China and other countries of the region because of the aggressive policies.
Thank you very much indeed. Natasha, Kassam.
I too am perhaps pessimistic, but a few points of optimism. One is that with that growing concern and awareness about the various threats that we've discussed, there are smaller states claiming agency and responsibility for their security. So, I think it's incredible from where I sit in Australia to see islands in the South Pacific navigate great power competition, to see countries in Southeast Asia working together to find their best path forward. There is still great reluctance in many quarters, but the mood is shifting, and with that comes, I think, a pathway to stability. The other point of optimism I have is Taiwan. Taiwan, I think, is a place that many people feel very concerned about its future, but nobody was even talking about them really 10 or 15 years ago. So with increased attention and awareness of an island that is a democratic nation worthy of protecting, I think that gives me great optimism and hope for the future. And the thing that I'm most worried about, very briefly, I think, is that people are, as we've already said, are too easy to jump to the concern of war, but perhaps or to the possibility of war, but are not cognizant of the fact that this war could be nuclear, and that is something that should really be at the front of everyone's minds when they are thinking about that worst case scenario.
Thank you very much. Brilliant. Watanabe-san, over to you.
Yes, I try to be optimistic in the future of Indo-Pacific area and the whole world. And good sense of optimistic one is coming from many other panelists pointed out somehow the people's willingness to tackle on issue, and somehow that's good source. But unfortunately, current world framework is not ready for such kind of the people's aspiration. And somehow, however, some kind of the Quad cooperation, of course, NATO already, EU, or such kind of things is somehow the key to solve the many issues. And one optimistic and pessimistic view on China. Short term, very difficult to control China's assertive action. However, in the long run, China's economic growth is slowing down. And as economic is slowing down, however, China continues to have a very strong military. So very difficult to deter China's assertive action for a long time. But if lucky, we could avoid any the aggression. After that, probably we will face a declining China's economy. China's aging popularity and China's social network is very weak, and individually the gap between rich and poor is enormous. Wow, that's source of pessimistic, but that's not the soon. It's a long-term goal. At least we need to work on the short-term goal to the stability in the region.
Thank you very much indeed for all your wisdom and for both sharing your concerns and your sources of optimism. Unfortunately, our time is up. We had quite a session indeed. This was very exciting and to me also very enlightening. We've covered well, 2/3 of the globe really, all the way to the Antarctica, and this is cannot be a better start for this whole weekend of discussions in Riga conference. I want to thank all the panelists. I hope to see you before too long in the Baltic states, in Riga, Tallinn, Vilnius, or in Tokyo, Delhi, or Canberra. And I wish you all the best. Have a good evening in your countries, and all the best to all of us in Riga conference discussions. I look forward to them, and bye now.